I'm Dr. Sarita, Professor of Anatomy. I'll be discussing the development and fate of aortic arterial arches. Development of cardiovascular system is one of the first events in the embryonic organogenesis. The cardiovascular system develops mainly from the mesodermal germ cell layer and neural crest cells, which is derived from ectoderm. Vasculature of an organism has a daunting task of connecting placenta with the fetal heart and therefore all the organ system to nourish the tissue and sustain the life. During the 3rd to 8th week of intrauterine life, arterial and venous system develop simultaneously. Human embryonic disc, the vascular system, develops around approximately 18th to 19th day. When the embryo is no longer able to satisfy its nutritional requirements by diffusion alone. Three stages of nutrition to the embryo. The first is the nutrition of the embryo in early stages of development before implantation, followed by the development of extra-embryonic blood vascular system, which occurs earlier, and then comes the development of intra-embryonic blood vascular system and the development of the heart. Nutrition of the embryo in early stages of the development, that is the stage of morella, early stage of blastocyst, is predominantly by diffusion. Once the blastocyst has implanted, the nutrition is by uteroplacental circulation, which occurs around the 2nd week of intrauterine life. So the various stages of nutrition. So initially, morella receives nutrition from the cytoplasm which is stored in the fertilized ovum. Early stages of blastocyst, as it enters the uterus, gets its nutrition by secretion of uterine glands which diffuse through the blastocyst. Later, blastocyst is implanted and it receives nutrition from the endometrium. Three stages of implantation of blastocyst. So early stage of blastocyst, as it is implanted by the end of 7th week or the 7th day or the 1st week of intrauterine life. It gets its nutrition by erosion of endometrium wall via the cytotrophoblastic cells which pass through the lacunar stage by 9th day and finally establish uteroplacental circulation by the 12th day of intrauterine life. So therefore, the blood vascular system is formed by 3rd week of intrauterine life in two stages. Development of extraembryonic blood vascular system, which occurs slightly earlier, followed by the development of intraembryonic vessels and the heart. Angiogenesis or establishment of blood vascular system occurs in the early period of 3rd week. It starts in the extraembryonic splanchnopleuric mesoderm lining the yolk sac as blood islands. Then it arises, the blood vascular system also simultaneously occurs in the extraembryonic mesoderm in the connecting stop, followed by extraembryonic somatopleuric mesoderm lining the chorion, which finally develops into the villus, and villus is the one basically takes part in forming the placenta. Extraembryonic and intraembryonic blood vessels. They start by angiogenesis. They start in the mesoderm as clusters of mesenchymal cells in the chorion, connecting stalk and yolk sac wall. These clusters give rise to blood islands. Later, lumen is formed in the clusters. Cells in the peripheral part of the island form endothelial cells which further differentiate into the muscular and connective tissue coats. The central cells become free and gives rise to blood cells. Initially, they are the nucleated red cells. So blood vessels development occurs in two mechanisms. Vasculogenesis. In vasculogenesis, the vessels arise from collages of angioblastic cells. The second method where the blood vessels develop is angiogenesis. Here the vessels sprout from the existing vessels. So development of blood vessels are basically important, and it is the sonic hedgehog, a major signaling molecule of embryonic development, regulates the embryonic morphogenesis. Sonic hedgehog controls the organogenesis. It is secreted by notochord, which induces the surrounding mesenchyme to form vascular endothelial growth factor, which is a potent angiogenic factor, which helps in vascular cell differentiation initially from the stem cells, which followed by the vasculogenesis and vessel maturation. Coming to the function of vascular endothelial growth factor, which is very important signaling protein involved both in vasculogenesis, where the formation of embryonic circulatory system, and angiogenesis, where the growth of blood vessels occur from pre-existing vasculature. Vascular endothelial growth factor restores the oxygen supply to the tissues when blood circulation is inadequate, such as in hypoxic conditions. It the serum concentration of vascular endothelial growth factor is usually high in bronchial asthma and diabetes mellitus. Overexpression of vascular endothelial growth factor can cause vascular diseases in retina of the eye. Example, the retinoblastoma. Development of estroembryonic blood vascular system which starts in the early part of third week of intrauterine life. Blood vessels develop from the angioblastic cells which differentiate from the mesenchyme in three regions: in the wall of yolk sac, in the connecting stalk, and in the chorion. Intraembryonic blood vessels and blood cells are derived from the extraembryonic splanchnopluric mesoderm surrounding the yolk sac. Intraembryonic vascular system occurs later part of third week of development. So finally, it is the yolk sac is the first supplier of blood cells and continues up to 60 days as a hemopoietic organ. Later, liver, spleen, thymus and bone marrow take over the hemopoietic function. Blood vessels, dorsal aorta and cardinal vessels are the first vessels which are formed in the embryo. A pair of dorsal aorta and cardinal vessels, mainly by vasculogenesis. The rest of the blood vessels which are derived mainly by angiogenesis, that is the vitelline vessels which are derived from the yolk sac, umbilical vessels are from the placenta. These vessels are formed by angiogenesis. Entire vascular system is patterned by the guidance of vascular endothelial growth factor, the arterial system or the venous system. Intraembryonic arteries and the veins are initially arranged in pairs or bilaterally symmetrical. Later, number of changes occur in the blood vascular system. Main alteration occurs: 1. By fusion of paired vessels forming a single vessel, hypertrophy of one vessel and the atrophy of the counterpart, new sprouts of vessels which arise from the existing blood vascular system. Coming to the development of blood vascular system, we have to initially know about the development of the heart tube as a whole. Heart tube, the two heart tubes fuse together in the third week to form a single tube. The cranial end is the arterial end remains bifurcated. Similarly, at the caudal end, which is the venous end, which presents the sinus venosus with right and left horns. Craniocaudally, the heart tube presents the truncus arteriosus, bulbus cordis, primitive ventricle, primitive atrial chamber, and the caudal-most part, the venous end, is a sinus venosus with right and left horns. Development of arterial system starts with the development of aortic arterial arches, which occurs around 4th to 8th week of development. These aortic arch arteries, they start from the aortic sac. Aortic sac is a cranial end of truncus arteriosus. So truncus arteriosus, which is the cranial end of the heart tube, is divided by aorticopulmonary septum, which is derived from neural crest cells. Aorticopulmonary septum divides the truncus arteriosus, the outflow channel of the heart, into two components: ventral aorta or aortic sac, the pulmonary trunk. Aortic sac is therefore the cranial end, divides into right and left horns. Aortic sac or the ventral aorta with right and left horns. Therefore, the arterial system embryologically has four types of arteries. A pair of dorsal aorta, which is the first vessel which appears in the embryonic stage, followed by the first pair of aortic arch, and then it continues to form six pairs of aortic arch. These aortic arch arteries arise from the ventral aorta or aortic sac. Then arteries of the yolk sac are the vitelline arteries, and finally the arteries of the placenta are the umbilical arteries. During 4th to 5th week of development, six pairs of aortic arch arteries are formed from the ventral aorta or aortic sac. Arterial system embryologically is therefore has four types: the dorsal aorta, aortic arches, the ventral aorta, which is the cranial end of truncus arteriosus, the vitelline arteries, which arise from the yolk sac or which supply the yolk sac. Umbilical artery are the arteries of the placenta. The two ventral horns of ventral, the two horns of ventral aorta or aortic sac, which is the most dilated part of truncus arteriosus, the right horn and the left horn. So primitive aorta consists of three parts in relation to the pharynx, which is the cranial end of the foregut. A portion which is lying ventral to the foregut is the ventral aorta, the cranial end of the truncus arteriosus. An arch portion, the first aortic arch artery. A dorsal portion is the dorsal aorta. The aortic arch arteries, they arch over the primitive pharynx or the foregut. They connect the ventral aorta with the dorsal aorta. Successively, arterial arches appear from second to sixth, which are also known as pharyngeal arch arteries. and each is connected with the right and the left horn of aortic sac with the dorsal aorta. So coming to the important features, that is ventral aorta or aortic sac is ventral to the foregut and dorsal aorta is dorsal to the foregut. Six pairs of aortic arch arteries partially encircle the cranial end of foregut, that is the pharynx, and it's connected to the ventral aorta. And finally, these aortic arches, they reach the dorsal aorta. Caudally, dorsal aorta forms the future descending aorta as it fuses. So pharyngeal arches and aortic arch arteries. So each aortic arterial arches supply each pharyngeal arches, which are the mesodermal structures which are present in the neck or the cranial end of the embryo in the initial stages of development, which finally takes part in forming the head and neck region. So aortic arterial arches. These arterial arches finally they take part in forming the major arteries of head and neck and thorax. So primitive aorta, that is the two dorsal aorta, after the folding of the embryo, the two dorsal aorta caudally fuse at the fourth thoracic somite to form a single dorsal aorta. Aortic sac, which is a cranial end of the truncus arteriosus with right and left horn, is, gives rise to six pairs of pharyngeal arches which are connected to the dorsal aorta. So aortic arch arteries which arise from the ventral aorta, right and left horns, and finally end in the dorsal aorta. Termination into the left and right dorsal aorta. This occurs during the fourth to fifth week of intrauterine life. The same image showing the aortic arch arteries which traverse along the lateral wall of the cranial end of the foregut or the future pharynx, which mainly supplies the pharyngeal arches which are mesodermal, which are also 1 to 6 in number, and these aortic arch arteries finally end in the dorsal aorta arising from ventral aorta. Six pairs of aortic arch arteries, and we also have six pairs of pharyngeal arches which are numbered cranio-caudal sequence. All aortic arches are not present simultaneously, so fourth week contributes for an arterial arch which supplies a new pharyngeal arch as it forms, giving rise to total six pairs of aortic arch arteries, which corresponds to six pharyngeal arches which are mesodermal. By eighth week, the primordial aortic arch pattern is transferred into fetal arterial arrangement. Now coming to the development of the dorsal aorta, which is also known as the primitive aorta. A pair of dorsal aorta first appears in the flattened embryonic disc prior to the formation of embryonic folds. The dorsal aorta or the primitive aorta intervenes between the notochord and it is dorsal to the yolk sac. With the formation of the head fold of the embryo, the heart tube comes to lie ventral to the foregut. Craniocaudally, the heart tube presents the truncus arteriosus, the bulbus cordus, primitive ventricular chamber, primitive atrial chamber, and sinus venosus with the right and left horns. So, ventral aorta or aortic sac, the dilated distal part of truncus arteriosus is ventral to the pharynx or the foregut. Dorsal aorta is dorsal to the foregut. Initially, the dorsal aorta extends headwards towards the endothelial heart tube or the primitive heart tube, establishes connection with the primitive heart tube initially with the first pair of aortic arch artery. Later, the two dorsal aorta bends more ventrally along the wall of pharynx in the mesodermal core of first branchial arch, and it communicates with the two horns of ventral aorta via six pairs of aortic arch arteries. These aortic arch arteries are embedded in the mesodermal core of pharyngeal arches. Cranially, the dorsal aorta beyond the first pair of aortic arch are paired. Caudally, at the level of T4, it fuses to form a single dorsal aorta which forms later the descending aorta. Therefore, aorta consists of three parts: the ventral aorta, distal part of truncus arteriosus, ventral to foregut, which divides into right and left horns, and each horn is connected to the dorsal aorta by initially by first pair of aortic arch artery followed by six pairs of aortic arch arteries. Dorsal aorta, primitive aorta, cranially it is paired, and caudally it is fused to form a single aorta. So initially, each limb of ventral aorta is connected to the dorsal aorta by the first aortic arch with additional formation of branchial arches between 4th to 5th week. Additional aortic arches are formed. About 6 pairs. Aortic arch arteries appear in craniocaudal sequence. Aortic sac gives rise to therefore total 6 pairs of arteries. During further development, some vessels regress completely. The fifth pair is rudimentary and disappears in an early stage. Finally, the aortic arch arteries and dorsal aorta transformation occurs to form a definitive vascular system which occurs around the 8th week of intrauterine life. So therefore showing the primitive heart, the cranial end of which is a truncus arteriosus, which is further divided into ventral aorta and pulmonary trunk. The ventral aorta presents right and left horns and are connected to the dorsal aorta by aortic arch arteries. 6 pairs in number. So 6 pairs of aortic arch arteries embrace the lateral wall of pharynx from the ventral aorta to the dorsal aorta. The fifth aortic arch pair never forms or forms incompletely and later regresses. Consequently, 5 aortic arches are numbered as 1, 2, 3, 4 and 6, the Roman letters. Aorticopulmonary septum, which divides the truncus arteriosus into ascending aorta and pulmonary trunk, the outflow channels of the heart. The cephalic edge of aorticopulmonary septum fuses between the fifth and the sixth pair of aortic arch. As a result, upper 4 pairs of aortic arch arteries are connected to the ascending aorta, conveying oxygenated blood from the left ventricle. The sixth pair of aortic arch artery is connected to the pulmonary trunk, which carries deoxygenated blood from right ventricle to the lung, and sixth pair of aortic arch is also therefore known as the pulmonary arch artery. Coming to the fate of dorsal aorta. It has two important features, cranially and caudally. Cranially, each dorsal aorta extends headwards beyond the first aortic arch arteries towards the developing brain, and it forms the cranial part of internal carotid artery. This internal carotid artery gives off an ophthalmic artery which supplies the developing optic vesicles, anterior cerebral and middle cerebral artery to the brain, which takes part in forming the circle of Willis, and finally terminates as posterior communicating artery which joins the developing vertebral artery, which finally forms the basilar artery to join the posterior communicating artery. Vertebral artery is finally formed by the longitudinal anastomosis of cervical intersegmental artery which arise from the dorsal aorta. Caudally, the two dorsal aorta fuse caudocranially to form a single descending aorta from the fourth lumbar segment to the fourth thoracic segment, and this descending single aorta has three components: thoracic aorta from T4 to T12, abdominal aorta from T12 to L4, and middle sacral artery opposite the first sacral segment. Caudally, the dorsal aorta beyond L4 segment bifurcates and continues with the umbilical arteries. These umbilical arteries carry deoxygenated blood from the embryo to the placenta. Caudally, the dorsal aorta's branches, that is from the thoracic part of dorsal aorta. It gives two sets of branches, lateral splanchnic branches. They are the esophageal branches, bronchial branches, and mediastinal branches. The second set, which arises from the thoracic part of dorsal aorta, are somatic intersegmental branches. Posterior intercostal arteries, 3rd to 11th spaces. Similarly, the caudal part of dorsal aorta, the abdominal part of it, also gives three sets of or three groups of branches. Ventral splanchnic branches, these are unpaired branches, the celiac trunk, the superior mesenteric artery, the inferior mesenteric artery. They supply the derivatives of the foregut, midgut, and hindgut. Lateral splanchnic branches, they are paired branches. Inferior phrenic supplies the diaphragm, middle suprarenal, renal artery, and gonadal arteries. They supply the suprarenals, kidneys, and the gonads. The third group are the somatic intersegmental arteries. They are the lumbar arteries, four pairs which arise from the dorsal aorta, that is the abdominal part. The fifth pair arises from the medial sacral artery. Coming to the axis artery of the upper limb, arises from the seventh cervical intersegmental artery, which arises also from the dorsal aorta. Seventh cervical intersegmental artery forms main part of subclavian artery, which continues as axillary artery which supplies the upper limb. Similarly, the axis artery of the lower limb is the fifth lumbar intersegmental artery, which also arises from the dorsal aorta. Axis artery of the lower limb is represented as inferior gluteal branch, which finally incorporated into the internal iliac artery. So our arteries of the limb: axis artery of the upper limb, the seventh cervical intersegmental artery. It persists in adult as the axillary artery, brachial artery, anterior introitious artery, and deep palmar arch. Ulnar artery and radial artery arise as additional sprouts from the main artery. Axis artery of the lower limb is a fifth lumbar intersegmental artery, and arises and it is represented as inferior uteal artery. It is seen as a branch of internal iliac artery. Sciatic artery which supplies the sciatic nerve, a part of popliteal artery, peroneal artery and the plantar arch. Femoral artery, anterior tibial artery and posterior tibial artery, they arise as additional sprouts from the main axis artery. Now coming to the fate of aortic arch arteries. In human embryos, the aortic arch arterial pattern been considered in two phases. Branchial phase, which occurs around the 4th week of intrauterine life, to post branchial phase, which gives rise to final vascular system of the fetal region. So aortic arched arteries by 4th week, as the pharyngeal arches develop, which are supplied by aortic arch arteries which arise from the ventral aorta and terminate in the dorsal aorta. Aortic arch arteries are not all present at the same time. Initially, 6 pairs of aortic arch arteries develop between 4th to 5th week. Later, during the 6th week, 3 aortic arches disappear, that is first, second and the 5th aortic arch, and finally the aortic arches which persist at the end of 8th week of intrauterine life, that is 3rd, 4th and 6th aortic arch arteries, which finally form the final vascular system of the fetus. So aortic arch arteries are described in two phases: the bronchial phase, that is the beginning of 4th week, where 6 pairs of aortic arch arteries develop between 4th to 5th week. They finally transform into a definitive vascular pattern by end of 8th week of intrauterine life. They arise from ventral aorta and finally terminate at the dorsal aorta. Development and fate of each aortic arch arteries, and finally they reach at the end of 8th week the post-branchial phase. Now first coming to the development and fate of ventral aorta or the aortic sac and its right and left horns. Ventral aorta with right and left horns is a cranial end of truncus arteriosus. Aortic sac or ventral aorta forms the ascending aorta. Ventral aorta divides into right horn, which forms the brachiocephalic trunk. The left horn forms the proximal part of arch of aorta between the brachiocephalic trunk and left common carotid artery. So aortic sac, which has right and left horns, subsequently forms the brachiocephalic trunk, is derived from right horn. From the left horn, the proximal segment of aortic arch, respectively, that is between the brachiocephalic trunk and left common carotid. Coming to the development and fate of first and second aortic arterial arches. The first, the second aortic arterial arches, they appear and almost most of it disappear by the end of 27th day. The first aortic arch artery may persist as a small part of maxillary artery, that is the first part. Second aortic arch also disappears, but small part persists as stapedial artery and the hyoid artery. Let us go into the development of the first aortic arch. It appears on both the sides and finally it's obliterated on both the sides. A small portion forms a maxillary artery. This maxillary artery later becomes a branch of external carotid supplying the ears, teeth and face. First arch artery is obliterated before the sixth arch artery is formed. Second pair of aortic arch artery largely disappears. Its dorsal part persists as the hyoid artery and stapedial artery. Hyoid artery is prominent in early development, later it involutes. Similarly, stapedial artery extends cranially, passes through the mesenchymal primordia of stapes and later it also involutes. Let us discuss the detail about the hyoid artery and the stapedial artery. The hyoid artery, which is prominent in the early development, persists as keratotympanic branch which finally incorporated into the internal carotid artery, which mainly supplies the middle ear. Stapedial artery has an upper division and this upper division gives mainly two branches, the middle meningeal artery which supplies the meninges, the orbital branch transiently anastomoses with the ophthalmic artery and supplies the orbit. Stapedial artery, the lower division, is known as maxillomandibular division. It divides into inferior alveolar artery which supplies the lower teeth, infraorbital artery respectively. These two are finally becomes incorporated as a branches of maxillary artery. Stapedial artery and hyoid artery finally degenerates. Regression of first two pairs of aortic arch arteries is probably due to the caudal shift of the heart tube which occurs between 12th to 24th day. Persistent stapedial artery is a rare anatomical variant and presents as the pulsatile middle ear mass and sometimes causes conductive hear loss. Coming to the fate and development of third, fourth, sixth aortic arch arteries which are large and persist and give rise to the final vascular system of the fetus. Third aortic arch artery is known as carotid arch artery, persists on both the sides. It becomes the major part of carotid arterial system. It forms the common carotid artery, proximal part of internal carotid artery. An external carotid artery arises as an additional sprout from the carotid arch or the third arch. So therefore, the third aortic arch artery forms the common carotid on both the sides and the proximal part of internal carotid on both the sides. The cranial part of internal carotid artery is formed by the dorsal aorta. External carotid artery is a sprout which arises from third aortic arch artery. So finally, to conclude, the third aortic arch artery forms common carotid artery on both the sides, proximal part of internal carotid artery. The cranial continuation of internal carotid artery is formed by cranial continuation of dorsal aorta, which forms the distal part of internal carotid artery. And this part of internal carotid artery finally supplies the brain and the eye, giving rise to anterior cerebral, middle cerebral artery and ophthalmic artery to the eye. External carotid artery arises as a new sprout at the origin of third aortic arch artery. Fourth aortic arch artery is known as aortic arch artery or aortic arch. On the right side, it forms the proximal part of right subclavian artery. On the left side, it forms the major part of arch of aorta. Now coming to the fourth aortic arch artery which persists on both the sides, but ultimate fate is different on right and the left side. On the left side, it forms the arch of aorta between the left common carotid and left subclavian, left side of aortic arch. Aortic arch between the brachiocephalic trunk and left common carotid is derived from left horn of aortic sac. Right side of fourth aortic arch forms the proximal part of right subclavian artery. Distal part of right subclavian artery is derived from right dorsal aorta and right seventh intersegmental artery. That is the proximal part of right subclavian artery, which is derived from fourth aortic arch artery. That part, second component, is derived from dorsal aorta, right dorsal aorta, and the third component of right subclavian is derived from right seventh intersegmental artery, whereas the left subclavian artery is totally derived from left seventh intersegmental artery. Upper limb bud is therefore maintained by seventh intersegmental artery, which sprouts from the dorsal aorta, and this seventh intersegmental artery lies distal to the sixth aortic arch artery. So subclavian artery, to conclude the development, on the right side, the first component is derived from right fourth aortic arch artery, which forms the proximal part. The second part is formed by right dorsal artery, and the third part of right subclavian is formed by seventh intersegmental artery. On the left side, left subclavian artery is entirely formed by seventh intersegmental artery. Seventh intersegmental arteries, they arise from dorsal aorta. Schematic diagram showing the development of fourth aortic arch artery. On the left side, arch of aorta between common carotid, left common carotid and left subclavian. On the right side, it is the proximal part of right subclavian artery. The rest of the right subclavian artery is derived from right dorsal aorta and seventh intersegmental artery. Seventh intersegmental artery on the left side gives rise to entire left subclavian artery. Coming to the postbronchial phase, the fifth aortic arch never forms, or it is small and completely regress. Sixth arch is known as the pulmonary arch. On the left side, it has ventral part and dorsal part. Ventral part, and similarly on the right side, it has two parts, ventral part and the dorsal part. Sixth aortic arch artery is known as a pulmonary arch artery. It gives rise to two important branches to the developing lung buds. Sixth aortic arch artery on the right side, the ventral part, forms a right pulmonary artery. The dorsal part of sixth aortic arch artery loses its connection with the dorsal aorta and completely disappears. Ventral side, on the left side, the ventral part forms a left pulmonary artery. The dorsal part of sixth aortic arch artery persists in the intrauterine life, and it forms the ductus arteriosus. Later, after the birth, it is represented as ligamentum arteriosum. Ductus arteriosus in the fetal period, and it is patent, and it communicates the left pulmonary artery with the aortic arch artery beyond the origin of left subclavian artery. Fate of aortic arch arteries. First aortic arch artery represented as a maxillary artery. Second aortic arch is a hyoid and stapedial artery, which finally disappears and gives rise to number of important branches. Third aortic arch artery forms common carotid and proximal part of internal carotid artery on both the sides. Fourth aortic arch artery on the right side forms the proximal part of right subclavian artery. Fourth aortic arch artery on the left side forms arch of aorta between left common carotid and left subclavian artery. Sixth aortic arch artery on the right side forms right pulmonary artery. On the left side it forms left pulmonary artery and the ductus arteriosus. Relation of aortic arch artery is to the cranial nerves of branchial arches. The first pharyngeal arch, branchial arch, supplied by the mandibular nerve. The second pharyngeal arch is supplied by facial nerve. The third pharyngeal arch is supplied by glossopharyngeal nerve. Fourth pharyngeal arch is supplied by superior laryngeal nerve, and they are closely related to the corresponding aortic arch arteries. Sixth pharyngeal artery, sixth pharyngeal arch is a recurrent laryngeal nerve. This slight difference in relation with the aortic arch artery on the right side and on the left side. This is mainly due to the important changes which occur in the aortic arch artery. Degeneration of the dorsal part of right sixth aortic arch and complete degeneration of fifth aortic arch artery and elongation of neck. The right recurrent laryngeal nerve hooks around the fourth aortic arch artery, the proximal part of subclavian artery on the right side. On the left side, left recurrent laryngeal nerve hooks around the sixth aortic arch artery, that is the ductus arteriosus. So finally coming to the summary of development of arch of aorta, which is mainly from three sources: between the bronchocephalic trunk and left common carotid, left limb of aortic sac. The second component between the left common carotid and left subclavian is left fourth aortic arch. Between the left subclavian and the origin of ductus arteriosus is left dorsal aorta. Changes which occur during mainly due to the postbranchial phase. Changes in the arterial arch system due to the caudal displacement of heart, regression of the first and second aortic arch arteries. The blood in the third aortic arch artery is directed in a cephalic end of the embryo. The blood in the fourth aortic arch flows caudally. The important changes which also occur in the blood vascular system of aortic system: the dorsal aorta located between the third and the fourth aortic arch is known as the carotid duct. It finally gets obliterated and the dorsal aorta cephalic to the carotid duct forms the cranial part of internal carotid artery, which supplies the brain and the ear and the eye. The dorsal aorta disappears between the origin of seventh intersegmental artery on the right side and the junction of left dorsal aorta. And from here it is a single descending aorta. So these changes which occur are: 1. The dorsal aorta between the entrance of third and the fourth arch, which is known as carotid duct, is completely obliterated. The right dorsal aorta disappears between the origin of seventh intersegmental artery and junction of left dorsal aorta. Due to the cephalic fold, the growth of forebrain, elongation of neck, and heart descends into the thoracic cavity, the brachiocephalic trunk, the left common carotid, and the subclavian artery elongates considerably. Vessels that are obliterated during postbranchial phase: 1. Right dorsal aorta. 2. dorsal part of sixth aortic arch on the right side, fifth aortic arch on both the sides, 4 carotid duct obliterates on both the sides, second aortic arch and the first aortic arch are completely obliterated. So changes in the original aortic arch system, complete obliteration of right dorsal aorta from 7th intersegmental artery on the right side and left part of dorsal aorta, obliteration of the dorsal part of 6th aortic arch, bilateral obliteration of 5th aortic arch, obliteration of carotid duct which is a part of dorsal aorta between 3rd and the 4th aortic arches, complete obliteration of 2nd and the 1st aortic arch arteries. So vessels that finally persists during the post-branchial phase are 3rd aortic arch which forms the common carotid and proximal part of internal carotid artery, 4th aortic arch, the left horn of ventral aorta and left dorsal aorta represented as the arch of aorta. On the right side, 4th aortic arch forms the proximal part of right subclavian artery. 6th aortic arch, the ventral part forms the right and left pulmonary arteries. 6th aortic arch, the dorsal part on the left side forms the ductus arteriosus. So this is once again showing the development of arch of aorta, first part, second part and the third part. Both the sides, the common carotid and internal carotid artery, first part is derived, ventral part of third aortic arch forms a common carotid artery on both the sides, dorsal part of third aortic arch and the dorsal aorta cranial to carotid duct forms the internal carotid artery. External carotid artery spouts as a bud from the third aortic arch. Subclavian artery on the right side is derived from three sources. The proximal part is from the right fourth aortic arch artery. The intermediate part, right dorsal aorta. The distal part is finally continues as right seventh intersegmental artery. On the left side, subclavian artery is totally derived from left seventh intersegmental arteries. These intersegmental arteries are the branches of the dorsal aorta. Overall, coming to the summary of development of various arteries. External carotid, a bud from the third aortic arch artery on right side and the left side. Internal carotid artery arises from the third aortic arch and cranial end of dorsal aorta on the right side and also on the left side. Common carotid artery arises from third aortic arch artery from right and the left side. Subclavian artery on the right side, fourth aortic arch artery, dorsal aorta right side, right seventh intersegmental artery. On the left side, it's totally derived from left seventh intersegmental artery. Bronchocephalic trunk is derived from right horn of aortic sac. Arch of aorta is derived from left horn of aortic sac, left fourth aortic arch artery and dorsal aorta. Pulmonary arteries are derived from ventral part of sixth aortic arch artery. Ascending aorta and pulmonary trunk are derived from truncus arteriosus which is divided by the spiral septum. Descending aorta is derived from dorsal aorta. This is the overall summary of the adult arterial system. Thank you very much.